great actually seeing so many familiar faces here, as well as new faces. We started the ITU Architecture lecture series early this year in order to have open debates on contemporary challenges and opportunities regarding design, architecture, and urbanism through best practices and academic discussions, and considering some of the promises future holds. Since then, we've had 5 internationally renowned speakers from the field of design and architecture. This evening, we're hosting the 6th and the final lecture of this semester, and I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker, Professor David Banister. Just a little bit of introduction about David, although it's quite huge, I'd like to make the whole introduction about David. So, just to start off, David is an emeritus professor of transport at the School of Geography and the Environment and the Transport Studies Unit at the University of Oxford. He's a fellow of St. Anne's College. He was Director of Transport Studies Unit from 2006 until 2015, and he was also Acting Director of Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Until 2006, before he joined the TSU, he was Professor of Transport Planning at the University College London, where he spent about, I think, 25 years, long career. During that time, he's also been a research fellow at the Warren Centre in the University of Sydney on sustainable transport for Sustainable City project, and also was a visiting professor at Timbergen Institute in Amsterdam. Professor Banister authored and edited 23 books that summarize his own research, as well as some of the international projects and collaborations he's involved in. His latest book, Inequality in Transport, was published in 2018, and I'm sure he'll be talking about it. He has also authored and co-authored more than 200 papers and a similar amount of other papers in web-based journals and contributions to other books. Other outputs include research monographs, over 50 reports for research institutes and sponsors, over 100 reports, and within a 12-year period, he's presented over 120 papers in national and international conferences. He has an established international reputation in transport research, and his main research areas concentrates on the policy scenario building, policy interventions, and planning interventions to reduce the need for travel, climate change, energy and environmental modeling, and transport investments and their economic impacts. The title of David's lecture today is Future of Mobility in Cities and Sustainable and Smart, with critically followed with a question mark. Further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor David Banister.
Thank you for those kind words. It's I say this, it's always nice to come. I love being in cities. Cities is my sort of, I feel most comfortable in them. And what I don't like is the traveling to the cities. Somebody has to devise a method of getting me from where I am to where I want to be very quickly, which is painless and uses very little energy, produces no carbon, and is a real pleasurable experience. And unfortunately, that isn't the case. I was here in 2015, 4 years ago, and Istanbul has changed out of all recognition in that period of time. It really is surprising, and I'm sure other cities have as well, but there's so much going on here. And so talking about the future mobility in future cities, sustainable and smart, and as Ada says, question mark, is quite a daunting task. And what I want to do is to just briefly say something about the problem as I see it, then to talk about a piece of work that I did 10 years ago, which is one of the pieces of work that I'm best known for, I think, which is a sustainable mobility paradigm, which was a paper that was published in 2008. Then to see how that has actually changed. Has things changed in the last 10 years? And I think they have. I'm not sure whether for the better or for the worse. And then finally, to begin to think about what I consider to be a sustainable transport system within a city, such as Istanbul, or ones I'm more familiar with in the next century. So let's get cracking. So the problem itself, is that going to work for me? Is well known. Can you all see that? I write in big writing, so that's okay at the back, is it? Good. Okay, so we need transport. There's no getting away from it. Even if we were to invent this frictionless way of moving between places, we need to get around. The global systems at the moment are based on long transport networks. Whether it's goods, whether it's passengers, they all travel internationally. There's no getting away from it. And there are likely to continue to be increasing levels of mobility in the forthcoming years. And this means, or has meant in the past, is that we're using more energy in transport, and we're also producing more carbon in transport. And this has not been good news. Where other sectors have managed to reduce their dependence on carbon-based resources, transport is proved to be rather very problematic. Roughly speaking, about a quarter of global carbon dioxide comes from transport sector. So I put a figure there of 8.5 gigatons. This has been increasing steadily over time. So whilst other sectors have reduced their carbon, transport has increased its carbon. And the targets that have been agreed at Paris in the COP21 agreement of 2015 and the more recent IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report, suggested that 50% was a target that the EU should look at, but not over a longer period to 2050, but to 2030. So both the scale of reduction required has increased and the time length over which that takes place has also decreased. But globally, the figure is 60% by 2050 at the present time. We have globally about 1 billion vehicles. That includes cars, trucks, and three-wheelers, motorized three-wheelers. It's likely that this will increase to about 2.5 billion. So we have a problem in terms that we're trying to reduce carbon, but the numbers of vehicles that are on the roads are increasing hugely over the next 30 or 40 years. And much of the debate has been defined by carbon, but as we shall see, this has now changed fairly substantially. So again, as I said, these are quite well known, but you can take several different estimates, but the figures are sort of roughly similar in the sense that we're expecting a doubling of traffic until 2050, which means per person is an increase to 11,000 kilometers per person per year, and this is with a much larger global population over that period of time, meaning an increase of 80%, not a reduction of 60% in carbon emissions. In addition to that, there are over 1 million road fatalities each year globally. So society is in some ways prepared to accept a huge cost for this high levels of mobility and a further 50 million injured. And this all has very widespread impacts on congestion and the quality of life. If we look at cities, the cities are where the people are moving to at the moment. The number of megacities, those are cities over 10 million, will increase from about 30 currently to about 37 in 2025. And by that sort of time, we're expecting about nearly 70% of the population living in those cities. So society is becoming more urbanized, and there's a huge growth both in the very large cities like Istanbul. London just about gets into that category of megacity, but also in the medium-sized cities from 5 to 10 million population. So how do we approach this sort of problem? And the way I looked at it 10 years ago was in this sort of format. I went back to what my professors have been teaching me about transport planning, and they talked to me about the transport planning model: trip generation, trip distribution, modal split, trip assignment. It was all there, lovely sort of formalized way of doing it, about looking at travel problems. But I decided that, yep, that's okay in one sense, but if we're interested in sustainable mobility, how would we reinterpret that? So I started asking questions about the trip. Should we actually be making the trip at all? Are there ways in which we can do less trip making? Are there ways in which we can do trip tours? Are there ways now that we can use the internet instead of traveling? Are there opportunities there that we can reduce the numbers of trips? And then the trip distribution question was about trip distance, which I feel particularly strong on, because that's the one that incorporates the land use parameter, linking up land use and transport. And it was saying, can we, through land use planning, make trips shorter? If we can make trips shorter, then we're actually beginning to make progress towards sustainable mobility. So shorter trips means that we are able to use more walking, more cycling, possibly more public transport, and this will again reduce the amount of energy and the amount of carbon that we're producing in the atmosphere. Then thirdly was the mode of transport. Again, that's the modal split part of it, trying to make use of those forms of transport that are most efficient. And then finally, this didn't quite fit in, it wasn't really assignment, so I put it to one side, was, okay, if we do need to use motorized transport, how can we make that most efficient? How can we use the most efficiently designed vehicles, the most fuel efficient vehicles, and increase the load factors? So it was trying to question the conventional thinking. And it can be summarized, I think, in seven different sort of categories, some of which I've sort of alluded to already. It was trying to get away from the notion of minimizing transport time. And this, I feel, and I've done a lot of work, and I find it a little bit frustrating, is trying to look at ways in which we can say, what is a reasonable travel time? So if you're traveling to work or traveling to the shops or traveling to the local school, what is a reasonable travel time? Is it half an hour? Is it 20 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? If we know about that, then we can try and design a system that might actually work within those constraints. The current sort of methods heavily emphasize travel time savings and the value to society in some ways that travel time savings produce. Yes, they are important, but it's not the only criteria that should be used. Secondly, they were saying that travel was, conventionally speaking, travel is seen as just as a derived demand. What that means is that people don't like traveling, but they only travel because of the benefits, the opportunities they get at the destination. If they weren't there, they wouldn't travel. I think increasingly we're seeing travel more as a valued activity. People like traveling, so how can we make that experience a positive one? And the next ones are sort of, we've discussed already, reducing the need to travel through distance reduction, through remote working, trying to get significant modal shift to walking, cycling and public transport, lower levels of pollution and noise from transport by greater efficiency. But then the last two, again, are slightly different. How can we make best use of the system that we actually have? How can we make it, the management of the system, far more effective? So we can increase the use by using larger or different types of vehicles. We can get higher occupancy rates and load factors in freight. And we can also use demand management and price accordingly. But what we're trying to do overall is trying to increase the quality of places and spaces within cities. And underlying this argument is the one that what sort of cities do we actually really want our city to be? What do we see Istanbul actually being? What is our vision of Istanbul in 20 years' time? What sort of city do we want? And how can we design a transport system that will allow us to achieve that. The way we do it at the moment, it seems, is that we do it the other way around, that we have a transport problem and we try to resolve it. We're not looking at transport within that wider context. So that was my thinking about 10 years ago. And so I then, more recently, have said, right, well, where do we now reside, say, now in 2019? And my conclusions were that I can still see very positive opportunities for sustainable mobility in cities. And those issues I raised 10 years ago are still very relevant. But there are new problems and new possibilities. And I think there are two new areas that weren't very much in the discussion 10 years ago, but are there now. One is a much greater emphasis on health and local pollution. Okay, local pollution has always been important, but it's the health dimension that has suddenly become a key issue. And again, if we look at the data, it suggests that transport is not just a key contributor to carbon dioxide, it is a key contributor to carbon monoxide, the oxides of nitrogen, and particulate matter, which is the small sooty matter that you inhale when you're close to traffic. And I think it's important as well because local pollution is a much easier conversation to have with people and with businesses. People can see that the air is polluted. People can feel it in their lungs. Their children feel it if they're asthmatics and things. When we're talking about carbon dioxide, it's really difficult. If someone asks me to say, well, what's the problem? We need carbon dioxide to live. We need to breathe it. Carbon dioxide is invisible. It is tasteless, it smells. It's very difficult to get that message across to people as to it's a problem, and the problem is a global problem. So the local pollution and health issues is a much easier, and I think one of the great changes that's taken place in the last year is the public health people have become much more interested in transport. In many ways, they're actually leading the debate. They have huge databases. They're able to do lots of quite interesting analysis. But I want to just refer to one of the pieces of work that was produced by a colleague of mine, Christian Brand, and a colleague at Bath University in the UK, Alistair Hunt. And this was produced last year, about a year ago. And it was the first attempt to quantify the health costs of air pollution from cars and vans. And their results, this report that was produced for an NGO, and it was part of the Clean Air Day last year, in June last year. And what they were trying to do was to calculate the individual costs of each car and van on the NHS and wider society. So premature deaths in the UK are estimated from, or transport-related premature deaths from health are estimated to be 40,000 in the UK and 9,000 in London. So the problem of people, this is people who are dying prematurely or before they would normally do if they'd not had suffered from the health effects. This is far higher than the level of crashes, road crashes in the UK. It's a far bigger problem, but it's a much harder problem both to define and to quantify. But this study, the Brandon study, came up with some figures suggesting that diesel cars produce 7 times as many local pollutants as petrol cars and 20 times as much pollution as electric vehicles. And the average annual cost for each car per year was £121, which I'm not sure, is that about 1,000 lira? That's another thing that's changed since I've been here, is the value of the lira. I can't remember, it was about 6 or something. It's now 8 to the pound or something, yeah. Anyway, but that was the figure they came up with in terms of the cost to the health service of treating these people. And in inner London, the cost for each vehicle was about £7,700, and for a van, it was 24,000. And these were the sort of figures they came up with, the different types of vehicle. And this report was not necessarily instrumental, but it was important in determining the recent move towards having a zero emissions, low emissions area within London and extending it, because it was the first time that these costs were actually really quantified. So that's one issue, I think, the health issues, the local pollution issues. The second one is the inequality issue, that this has become far more important, I feel, over the last 10 years, and the issues of who is actually gaining and who is actually losing from large-scale transport infrastructure investment, who is gaining from subsidy, who is actually losing from subsidy. And there are many forms of subsidy to all types of users, to air travellers, we can discuss that, to car drivers, rail users. And the argument here is that the rich benefit far more than the poor. And this in transport, I mean, in many other areas, this is seen to be hugely important. In transport, it doesn't. No major party really talks about this issue. And what these big projects and what the subsidies do is allow the rich to travel further, faster, and more often. And the poor, in the bottom right there, travel less, more locally, but are impacted more by the actions of others. So this is sometimes called a double injustice. So the people that are creating the problem are the ones that are benefiting. The people who are not creating the problem are not benefiting, but they're impacted by those people who are doing a lot of traveling. And some people call it a triple injustice, because these people are not the people that know how to complain about it. They're not well engaged with the political system. They're not well engaged with sort of jumping up and down and saying there's a problem. They're the people that are really suffering from that. And this is part of what is in this the recent book that Edda referred to. And the graphics, that's the high-speed train in the UK that's being built, and that's a large aeroplane coming in into Heathrow and over housing. But if we look at this, and part of the book looks at this, what I've done in the book is take the travel patterns in Great Britain for a 10-year period from 2002 to 2012. And what I've done is to look at the lowest ventile in the middle column. Oops, I can't move away from. In the middle column and the highest ventile. These ventiles, this is the 5% in the bottom income group and the 5% in the top income group. So this shows you the difference between the poorest and the richest people in Britain, in Great Britain. And then we look at different forms of transport: car travel, walking, cycling, bus, rails, and that sort of thing. And we look at the numbers of trips made per person per year. This is an average in that group. The distance travelled, and sorry, again, we use in Britain something called miles. So 1,500 miles is about 2,500 kilometres, I think, something of that order. And 7,000 miles is about 12,500 kilometres. But those are the numbers, 200 plays 550. So if we look at car travel, the rich, as one would expect, make more trips. They travel much further. Walking, the poor make more trips. Cycling is about the same, very low nationally. The bus trips is the reverse. It's the poor that use the buses. They make about 3 times as many trips as the rich do. The reverse is true for rail travel, and if we look at rail distance travelled, again, it's even more. And the final column shows the ratio of one over the other. And I think what surprised me more than anything was the scale of it. I expect there would be a difference, but it was the scale of that. And the scale was particularly evident in car distance, which is nearly 5 times as much, but also in rail. And within that, I've also looked at high-speed rail, and the figures are even higher. So the richest groups are making traveling 5 times as far by rail as the poorest income group. And if we look at the public investment that's made, half of that goes to rail and 9% goes to bus. And if we look at subsidy, the richest 10% get twice as much as the poorest 10%. And on air travel, which is one of my favorite sort of topics, not on urban, we find in the UK that 50% of people have not made a flight in the last 12 months. And this has been a stable factor for 15 years. Okay, so the increase in air travel in the UK is the people that do travel are traveling more frequently. Okay, it's not saying that the same 50% don't travel, but it's saying at an aggregate level, 50% don't travel. So my sort of summary there would be, does low-cost airlines appeal to low-income people? My argument would be, no, it doesn't. It allows rich people to travel more frequently to a wider range of destinations. It's very difficult to prove that. The data is very difficult to get hold of, but I keep suggesting to my students this will be a fantastic master's project and things, but nobody yet has actually taken it up, I think, because it's too difficult. But if I offered any of my students an airline ticket, they would jump at the opportunity, do you see? So I can't win on this at all. It doesn't allow me, I haven't got there's no way out. So then where are we now? What's the sort of, where do I see this? And I see the sort of trying to look at the means by which we can, I don't mean necessarily slow down travel, because people would always say that travel is already too slow in cities. But it's trying to move away from the argument that faster is necessarily better. And I would argue that travel time reliability becomes much, much more important. So it's saying if I'm going to make a trip, if I'm going to come to, say, one of my lectures, I can leave a very tight time and I can always say, well, the bus was late or something like that. Whilst if I go for an interview somewhere, I'm going to leave a lot more time because I don't want to be late for that interview. So it's trying to reduce that variability in travel time to make travel time more reliable. And I see one way of really doing that is through urban planning and through shorter distances, because the shorter the distance, the more likely it is that that travel time window would be optimal. Secondly, that great cities have a high quality public transport system. I asked this, is there a city, global city anywhere, a global city that doesn't have a good public transport system? And someone probably say Los Angeles or something like that. And I will say to them, Los Angeles, point proved. Public transport is essential to the well-being of cities. I would also argue here that walking and cycling are important, and people have the right to a safe and secure local environment. The third point there is, I think the basic debate has moved away from the carbon debate. The carbon debate is still important, but it is so difficult to get the concept of carbon reduction. But it's now gone beyond that in terms of trying to promote local environmental quality and health. And increasingly, and I think this is a problem that will face all cities, is that cities have to work for everyone, not just the rich. Okay? What I call a dysfunctional city, it's fine if you're in a well-paid job and you've got somebody to drive you around or something like that. But every city needs people to support those high-paid jobs. So you need people in education, in health service, you need people, police, in that you need people who are cleaners, who make the sandwiches, who do everything else. That makes a vibrant city. And you can't just have a city that is only there for rich people. The city has to be inclusive. Otherwise, the city becomes dysfunctional. And there is an argument that cities even like London is moving in that direction, primarily driven by very high housing costs, which make it unaffordable for people on lower incomes, people who are needed within the city, to actually live in that city. So that's where we are. Let's have a look then at what I would see as being sustainable and smart. I feel that a lot of the so-called high ground, a lot of the argument has been hijacked by what I call the technologists. I edit one of the, I can call it the major transport journal, Transport Reviews, which has, if you believe in impact factors, which I don't, it has the highest impact factor. We get inundated with all the new technologies, papers on autonomous vehicles, papers on electric vehicles, papers on all these sort of guidance systems and that sort of thing. So this is what's, this is the flavor. This is what people are actually researching on at the moment. And what they seem to be promising is high mobility for all with renewable energy. And this is seen as being sustainable and smart. I don't think so. I don't think it will achieve that, and I don't think it's sustainable, and I don't think it's that smart either. I would start the other way round, and then I want to try and illustrate what I'm trying to get at, and hopefully that will work. So the first thing is to have a debate. It's to try and engage with the people. When I say the people, it's not just the people who live in the city, it's the businesses there, it's the institutions there, it's government, it's all different parties. What do they want? What are the big issues which are worrying them? And this issue about inequality, I think, is paramount here, because this is something that seems to be coming through more and more. Secondly, the new technologies tend to operate alongside existing technologies, don't necessarily replace them. So we can say that's good news or not such good news. And there's also the issue of transition. Even if we know what we want in terms of a technologically led future within the city, how do we get there? We know where we are, we know where we might want to be. It's a chasm between the two. It's really difficult to get that way. The third point is renewable energy. The energy mix itself is not carbon neutral. There's, even if we switch to electric vehicles, that often the electricity that's used to power them is not made from non-carbon based sources. There's also energy in the vehicles. There's energy in the system, the infrastructure. Transport's one of the major consumers of concrete, and concrete is one of the major consumers, or major producers rather, of carbon. And recycling is happening, but it's not as much as it could be. So by saying we're using electric vehicles is only part of the story. The energy has to come from clean sources, and we also need to look at the embedded energy within the vehicles. And there's another debate that needs to be had over local pollution, new concerns over local pollution. And even if everything is sort of clean energy, one of the main problems with vehicles is they run on tires. Tires are the major, or one of the major producers of particulate matters. So small particles of carbon are flipped off tires when they are used. Same happens in some metro systems as well, with if they've got rubber tires on their systems. So it's a much bigger issue than just looking at the energy source in terms of how it moves forward. But the two main concerns I have at the bottom here is how much space do we actually have within cities, and also what's happening to vehicles. It's really difficult to find out, and maybe, again, this is another great project for someone to do, is to find out how much, theoretically it should be quite easy to do, but it's really difficult to find out any data on this, this is the amount of street space at ground level that is allocated to transport or transport-related activities. So it's not high-rise and all that, it's looking at. And the best source that I found was a Habitat report in 2013, and it looked at 30 cities, and the figure was about 20%. This is ground floor use is street space. Okay, excludes open space, parks, and parking. I don't know where Istanbul would be, but London is about 22, and there's quite a lot of figures around that. Manhattan is much higher because of the high rise, and Hong Kong similarly. But the street network is crucial. It provides not just the transport network, it provides connectivity in a wide range of different ways. It's essential for production and commerce, and it also provides space often for water, or for internet connections, energy sources, and drainage and things. So it has a multitude of individual spaces. And if we look at that, the argument I'm trying to make here is that that's not going to change much. We're stuck with that, unless we're going to, in a whole-scale way, try and knock down cities and then rebuild them with much more space allocated to moving around cities. So we're in the situation of the image on the left-hand side there. And there's a lot of work that's been done. There's a colleague who I worked with at some time, Hermann Knopflaffer in Vienna, who did variants of the diagram on the right-hand side, or the three diagrams, which shows a street with a large number of cars and the people that would be in those cars, and saying that they could all get into one bus, and then saying that they could actually all cycle or something like that. And this shows the amount of street space that they would actually use. So a suggestion here might be that we should have some sort of hierarchy, okay? Most people walk, or say all people walk, so that should be a high point in our hierarchy. Secondly, cycling can be used by many. There's no real barriers apart from health barriers to cycling. Public transport, we've got bus and rail in a variety of different forms. Most of that can be used by most people. And when we think about the car, used by a lot of people, but are there opportunities to share it, to rent it, to hire it? So what we're trying to do here is to try and to find out the best way in which we can actually make use of the space that we have. And bear in mind that many cities, the space that is there is used for a variety of different purposes. It's not just for people moving around. Street markets, there might be outside schools, there might be, I don't know, people making deliveries, all sorts of things there that are causing disruptions to that. So it's saying, right, well, if we have this space, how are we going to make best use of it? And I think that's something that city planners should really be thinking hard about, on the basis that that's not going to change very much. And then we have the role of the car in the city. One of the things that seems to be worrying me more than I think anything is that the car takes up far too much space. It's big, and unfortunately it's getting bigger. It's not getting smaller. So the thinking here is, if we have cars at all, how can they be shrunk? Okay, how can we get around that problem? And here, I put some numbers up here. The Tesla is 5 meters long. It weighs 2¼ tons, okay? A electric Nissan in the middle of that picture is 4½ meters long, weighs 1½ ton. Standard Ford Fiesta, about the same sort of length, and weighs about the same amount. A bike is about 1.8 meters in length, and it weighs about 25 kilograms. Now, the big point here is, why are we put ourselves in a situation and here we are meant to be intelligent people and all this sort of stuff, that we've designed something that weighs something of the order of 30 times as much as what it's actually carrying. To me, this seems to be completely the wrong way to actually think of something. So one person in a Tesla it's 30 times, and even in a more modest car, is 20 times. I would put out a challenge that would be 1-to-1 as you know, what the vehicle we should be looking for should weigh no more than the person or persons it is actually carrying. So let's design a vehicle that will actually weigh something like a person, say 80 kilograms, 70 kilograms, or something like that. The only thing that comes near to it is the bike at the moment, okay? And that seems to me really good sense. Something weighing 25 kilograms carrying a person, that seems quite efficient. But all the rest seems to me to be thinking about the problem the wrong way around. So the number two thing is, first is the space, the second is, what about the car? Is there something we can do about the car in the city that will actually make it more amenable to working within that city? And also bear in mind that you know, that cities are social spaces. Cities are for people. Jan Gehl is I think I have a great deal of respect for his work, and you know, he talks about these sorts of issues. You know, you can say how good a space is by the numbers of people that are actually in that space. So what we should be thinking about perhaps is looking at the quality of life, city identity, looking at walkability, safe street-based activities, and allocation of space through all sorts of mechanisms, including regulation, pricing, and control of parking. That, to me, would be a really good start. But then I think we need to be thinking a little bit more dramatically, shall I say. And this would be my thinking at the moment on sustainable and smart urban mobility. So the question mark has gone, but smart has gone into brackets. So, so this would involve trying to think about what I was saying 10 years ago and what I'm saying now, and talking about the health and inequality implications. And recognizing that most trips in cities are short, as I will illustrate in a moment with respect to London. So on the axis, the horizontal axis, we have motorized on the left-hand side, we have active, healthy, and fair transport on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, we have conventional public transport, rail, bus. That's what we need for the cities. On the right-hand side, we have a proper walking network. And what a walking network is somewhere where the pedestrian feels comfortable and safe walking around the city. In between, we have possibly demand-responsive shared transport, this mobility as a service, which might include private operators with their apps and things. It might include taxi services in a variety of different ways. But further along the healthy and fair dimension would be this, what's sometimes now being called, certainly in the States, a little bit in Europe, this micro-mobility, which is looking at bikes, looking at dockless bikes, looking at e-bikes, looking at scooters, looking at e-scooters. So in many cities now in Scandinavia, e-scooters have really taken off. Certainly e-bikes in the Netherlands has again taken off. And then we have mobility hubs, which are social spaces, new hotspots in cities, where people can recharge bike scooters and possibly electric cars. So these will be the sort of spaces that people would meet and talk whilst their vehicle was being recharged. Now, to me, that sort of begins to fit together. I don't know if, how it translates to Istanbul. I'd be interested to hear your views. But just to give two examples, on the left-hand side is one of the standard electric bikes, 90-kilometer range, 3-hour recharge period, weighs 25 kilograms and goes at 25 kilometers an hour, has a 50-watt engine. Costs quite a bit, $3,200, but if you're in the down market version, you can go for the I don't have shares in any of these companies. I've thought about it, but maybe electric scooter, which is much less, a sixth of the price, has a shorter range, 30 kilometers. But 30 kilometers is fine for most types of activities. A longer recharge period, weighs about half as much as the electric bike, and has the same sort of maximum speed or speed that it can achieve. So yeah, these opportunities are here, and they're relatively cheap if people want to buy them, or even to hire those. So what does this mean if one was to move in this direction in London? And again, the third project for a student here would be to do a similar type analysis here in Istanbul. In London, there are nearly 20 million trips made in London each day by London residents, and of these, about 13 million are made by motorized modes. And the estimates here would be that of those, about nearly over 8 million could potentially be cycled all the way. So these would be cycle trips that would be take you under 20 minutes to do, which was what I would say would be a reasonable sort of travel time. So the trip would be about 20 minutes. It should be remembered that something like 60% of all trips in London are under 5 kilometers in length. It's very short trip lengths, okay? That is crow-fly distance, not street distance, but it gives an indication of what the potential actually is. So it's suggesting that the box at the bottom there would be a switch from car, from bus, from rail, and underground and taxi. And this could be, people would then be cycling or even on an electric scooter. So where I want us to end then is what I'm trying to argue for is to look at the space that's available, to look at the way in which that can be used most effectively. Secondly, to look at the different forms of transport and to move away from the car-based alternative. If we do have to have a car, then that vehicle should be really small, perhaps a low-speed electric vehicle or something like that, that begins to make the weight ratio that I've talked about more sensible. And what we're trying to do is create streets that are safe for walking, cycling and scooting, to maintain the quality of life and a city of short distances. And I think that this begins to get us towards inclusiveness. It begins to ensure access for all, and micro-mobility may be a way to do that. I think that we do have the embryo of some sort of quite new thinking on this, but we're a long way from actually looking to see whether this is the future of transport in cities. And I think you said 23. It's actually, well, we'll be in July 26. This is 24, 25, and 26. So one of the advantages of retiring, well, for me anyway, has been that I've been able to write a lot more than I have been when I was working full time. The bad news for you is that you've got a lot more to read, or you may have a lot more to read. But what I've been mainly talking about is the book in the center, and there's a website related to that book, which is given at the bottom of that slide. Anyway, I've finished, and I would welcome your questions. Thank you very much.